Welcome to the Open Minds podcast. I am really excited for this one. I am going to be interviewing Jerry Feierstein, ambassador, a veteran diplomat with a distinguished career spanning over 4 decades, specializing in Middle Eastern affairs and U.S. Foreign policy. Ambassador Feierstein has served with the as U.S. ambassador to Yemen from 2010 to 2013. Prior to that, he held ambassadorships in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Oman, which allowed him to build unparalleled understanding of regional diplomacy, security issues, and alliance building in the Middle East. Beyond his ambassadorial roles, he has also served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Currently, Senior Vice President at the Middle East Institute, please forgive me if that isn't current, in Washington, and he leads research and policy programs aimed at enhancing and understanding the region as a whole. We're here to talk about the Abraham Accords, Ambassador, but I would much rather talk about your over 4 decades of experience in the Middle East.
Thanks, Christopher, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have in whatever category you might want to ask them.
Well, Ambassador, let's begin with the Abraham Accords. You know, when you watch the media and you listen to some political thinkers, President Donald Trump ushered in the Abraham Accords, but I imagine that there was some underlying underpinnings that guided the Abraham Accords. This just didn't happen all of a sudden in 2020. So perhaps we can start by what led up to the Abraham Accords and how it formed in its creation.
Well, I think that you're absolutely right, Christopher. I think that, in fact, the Abraham Accords formalized relationships that actually have existed for some years. If you want to look at, particularly the three main Arab countries that signed Abraham Accords, Morocco, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. Morocco, in fact, has had a more or less open relationship with Israel that goes back decades, owing a lot to the fact that there was, before 1948, a rather large Jewish community in Morocco, and very close relations between the Moroccan royal family and the Jewish community there, and so it was natural, and even during the days where the Arab League was absolutely boycotting Israel, was not allowing any kind of economic or political contact. The fact is that Morocco had a relationship, and people traveled back and forth between Morocco and Israel fairly regularly. UAE and Bahrain, a little bit different. They don't have a long history of activity in the Levant. Nevertheless, the relationships did predate, and they developed really over the course of a number of years, primarily, at least initially, because they shared regional security outlooks, particularly in terms of the threat posed by Iran towards regional security and stability. And this was a natural area for Israel to cooperate with the Gulf states. And then beyond that, the UAE, again, in particular, because of its growing economic interests, the importance of Dubai as a financial center, but also because of the UAE's interest in strengthening its economic roles and becoming a regional economic power, along with its political strength, turn naturally towards Israel as again a source of advanced technology and investment opportunities. So for all of these states, there were natural relationships that existed that go back for at least a few years, if not many, many years, and that were the basis for their agreement to normalize in 2020.
Ambassador, so is it that the Trump administration saw that these countries would be okay by putting at the center the recognition of Israel, the centerpiece to the accords, to then pursue this and say, hey, there's these we can create an accord already with at least 3 states in the Middle East that already recognize Israel and accept Israel as a state.
Well, I think that that was an important part of it, and again, I think that they saw that that there was already a fair amount of political and economic exchange between Israel
Mm-hmm.
and these states, and that in terms of their perspective on the region, they saw these states as being perhaps ready to move beyond the old approach of focusing on the Israeli-Palestinian issue and going beyond that to recognize that these were states that were ready to have a relationship with Israel, even in the absence of a resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Ambassador, you've written extensively about how the Abraham Accords have actually shifted the balance of power and the strategic realignment in the Middle East, specifically when it comes to U.S. influence um, and its relationships both with traditional as well as emerging regional powers. And so I'd love for you to talk about the Abraham Accords because there's two components to it. And one component is very much the normalization, similar to I'm here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada US relations, normalized relations on trade, the economy, things like that. There are key elements of the Abraham Accords that I think most people would say that seems like a normal trade relationship, but it seems very abnormal for the region and for relationships with Israel.
Yeah, and an awful lot of that is exactly that.
Mm,
That these were states that were ready to have normal relations, that they were ready to move forward. Again,
mhm,
particularly the UAE, but to a lesser extent, Bahrain and Morocco saw that their economic interests would be strengthened
mhm,
by having an open relationship with Israel.
mhm,
That certainly for Morocco, there is a tourism component. They would like to see more of the Israeli tourist dollars spent in Morocco.
mm,
Bahrain, to a certain extent, also, and the UAE, and perhaps the most sophisticated economy in the region, saw that establishing strong economic ties to Israel would enable them to take advantage of some of Israel's technological prowess, the fact that they were also in many ways a middle income Western economy
mm,
that the Emiratis could build ties on, and that's what they've done. And
mm,
that also these were three states that were far, in many ways, far from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So they didn't
right.
necessarily see Israel as being threatening in terms of its inability to reach a resolution of that particular conflict. They were ready to move on, even if that conflict didn't exist.
Ambassador, I want to explore that a little bit more because the Abraham Accords, it's not the first accord that has been tried in the Middle East. There have been others, but the others centered on that core, excuse me, that core issue of Israel and Palestine and that conflict there. Whereas the Abraham Accords focus on the recognition of Israel, others before have recognized Palestine or recognized the conflict. How would you respond to folks saying that the Palestinian issue is being sidelined in the Abraham Accords and what's trumping it, no pun, are the economic issues there?
Well, that was certainly the thought when the original Abraham Accords were signed.
Mm,
And the Trump administration had what's been dubbed an outside-in approach, so that historically, both in the region and in the broader international community, the idea was always that you needed to resolve the issue of conflict between Israel and its immediate neighbors
right.
before you could expand to the rest of the region. So the emphasis was on getting deals with Egypt and then Jordan. The
Mm,
administration and the government of Israel at the time spent a lot of time trying to find a solution to the Israeli conflict with Syria, and came
Hmm.
very close to doing that. And then, of course, the Palestinians. So it was always that, what were called the frontline states,
Hmm.
that you needed to resolve those issues before you could expand. The Abraham Accords, in a sense, turned that on its head. And basically, what it said is, if we can have agreements that integrate Israel into the broader region, beginning with some of the countries that aren't, particularly focused on those frontline states, but for other reasons want to establish a closer relationship with Israel, that will then put pressure on the frontline states, and here we're talking primarily about the
Hmm.
Palestinians, to come to some accommodation with Israel.
Right.
That it would isolate them in terms of their regional partners, and that in turn would mean that they would find a way of accommodating Israeli interests and reaching a resolution. That was, in
Hmm.
fact, the case from 2020, and we saw that the Biden administration, even though there had been some hope on the part of Palestinians and many others that the Biden administration would begin to go back to focusing on the Israel-Palestine conflict, the fact is that the Biden administration continued to look primarily in terms of Abraham Accords,
Hmm.
focus on trying to get an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. That
Hmm.
all came to a kind of a crashing halt on October 7th. And of
Right.
course, there are many people who believe that one of the objectives of the October 7th terror attack by Hamas was that, in fact, they were looking to end the dialogue about Abraham Accords
Hmm.
and bring the focus back to the Israeli Palestinian conflict. And to a certain extent, they've done that, so
Hmm.
that even among those states that have signed agreements with Israel, there's now a limit to how far they're willing to go, recognizing that regardless of what the leadership believes, regardless even of what the business community might believe, their populations have reestablished that the Israel-Palestine conflict is important for them,
Hmm.
and that they don't want to see a lot of forward movement in terms of establishing these other relationships, unless it also means that there's going to be an effort to resolve the Israel Palestine conflict.
Ambassador, that was a great answer because my follow up to that was the Abraham Accord seemed to be that like low hanging fruit. You mentioned Morocco with the trade relations and the Israeli tourist dollars, but the other side to that low hanging fruit is the real alienation that it stands to do with countries and regions that are directly connected and impacted by the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Was there any consideration by the Trump administration on countries who are directly impacted with regards to the Abraham Accords to say, we do have these Abraham Accords, but, kind of don't worry, we will work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict resolution as well?
No.
Okay.
The short answer is no.
I
And
see.
in fact, quite the contrary, that the Trump
Ah,
administration believed that by pursuing the Abraham Accords, they would isolate the Palestinians and
ah,
basically force the Palestinians to accept um, a uh, a resolution. And they did put a proposal on the table to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict, but it was one that was so one-sidedly in favor of Israeli interests,
hmm,
including, of course, recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, moving the
right.
U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, taking other steps, establishing a very close relationship with some of the more extreme elements of the Israeli political spectrum,
Hmm,
including those who are pursuing the settlement activities. That there was not, in fact, much there that the Palestinians could find agreeable, and the Palestinians, of course, fundamentally refused to engage with the Trump
hmm.
administration on any of these initiatives.
And Ambassador, given your over 4 decades of experience, I don't want us to get into speculation here, but I do want to tap into your experience and your understanding of the region to say what would have been a more delicate balance of a policy shift that perhaps the Trump administration could have made in tandem with the Abraham Accords, because I do hear that there are countries who want to recognize Israel as a state, tap into those dollars, that economic prowess. So the Abraham Accords play a very pivotal role, but also recognizing that there's a real opportunity not to alienate those countries that are directly impacted by the conflict.
Well, and that raises the question of how the U.S. should go on
Mm-hmm.
from this point, because the Abraham Accords exist; they are a
Yeah.
reality on the ground. But I think that there's certainly some hope that again in the aftermath of the of October 7th and the military operations in Gaza,
Yeah.
that there will be new opportunities to address the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that there is a framework that exists that could be picked up.
Mm-hmm.
There is still, the idea of a two-state solution, even though many people think that that is no longer feasible. Nevertheless, it is still there. It's still something that might be worked on. I think that a more balanced U.S. approach would certainly focus on the issue of settlements
Mm-hmm.
and the problem that the settlements create in
Right.
terms of trying to establish any kind of self-determination for the Palestinian people, any kind of an independent Palestinian state. Um, and, uh, and I think that, that we can go back to the basic principles that were established in the Oslo agreements
Mm-hmm.
of borders that were more or less along the lines of the 1967 borders, recognizing the need for some adjustments, territorial adjustments that would be balanced out between Israelis and Palestinians, leaving open the question of East Jerusalem and whether that might be the capital of an independent Palestinian state, and doing something
Mm-hmm.
that to basically ensure that if there is an independent Palestinian state, that it is established with territorial integrity and the capacity really to establish a viable political and economic entity,
Mm-hmm.
and that would mean, of course, addressing the settlement issue, which has only gotten worse,
Mm-hmm.
much worse over these past years.
Ambassador, I always think about the Oslo Accords as the best, quote unquote, of both worlds. I mean, it really does chart the path towards uh, a level of peace and prosperity. And I think now, as you mentioned, the political landscape in the regions have changed and leaders have moved on. However, the settlements, as you've just mentioned, are still a big issue. I think there's a real opportunity here to, maybe with public education and other pieces, the emerging leaders coming up inside the region can start looking at the Oslo Accords as really that step forward in adhering to and protecting those boundaries that were once established and adhered to at one point.
Yeah, I think that that's right. The problem with the Oslo Accords was that it established a bilateral framework for negotiation.
Hmm.
So fundamentally, it became a negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians.
Mm.
The problem with that, of course, is that the imbalance of power
Right.
and capacity between the two sides was such that it really was not a negotiation. The
Right.
Palestinians were weak.
Hmm.
They had no ability to really pursue their interests. There was a very weak government with a lot of Israeli intrusion,
Hmm.
security and governance, financial intrusion, and so the conceit, if you will, of Oslo was that these two parties were going to negotiate, that the United States was going to be the single mediator
Mm.
between Israelis and Palestinians. That proved to be a very flawed approach. The Israelis, and we've heard, directly from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israelis had no interest and no will to actually agree to an independent Palestinian state,
Hmm.
and never actually participated in the negotiations
Hmm.
in a good faith way.
Right.
And the United States, because of its own domestic politics and its own view of the nature of its relationship with Israel, had no capacity or will either to pressure the Israelis
Hmm.
to make the concessions that would be needed in order to get to an agreement.
Hmm.
So the possibility of actually using the Oslo framework to get an agreement was never really there, and the result was that from 1993, when the accords were signed, until they ultimately collapsed in 2000 with the start of the Second Intifada, that there was really no progress in establishing a solution on any of the outstanding issues, and we're no closer to reaching a final status solution at the end of the process than they were at the beginning. In fact, in some ways, we are farther away from it than ever.
Hmm. Ambassador, this isn't about domestic policy and domestic politics, but it's interesting how domestic politics plays a very important role in the leadership within the region in the Middle East. I mean, Netanyahu has conservative elements of Israel as well as more liberal elements, and the conservative elements do hold on to some very important values that Netanyahu and his government must uphold, very similar in many ways, to the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. And so when we think of the Middle East and we think of the leadership, we have to remember that there's a real domestic politics that rises to the top for these leaders that they must contend with on a day-to-day basis. The House of Saud is made up of, there are factions in place that really do govern in some ways, how MBS operates on the international scale.
That's right, and of course, what we've seen in the Israeli political spectrum is that the country has moved increasingly to the right,
Hmm.
and we now have in Jerusalem probably the most extreme right wing government in the history of Israel,
Hmm.
including people in powerful positions in the cabinet who have been very clear that they will never agree to an Israel to a Palestinian state.
Wow.
They will never stop the settlement activity. In fact, they've expanded it, and that they have
Hmm.
very extreme views about the nature of the conflict, about the nature of the Palestinian population, and that makes the likelihood of getting to an agreement, because Netanyahu is dependent on these elements for his own political survival,
Right.
that it means it's almost impossible that this government that's in power now will ever be the one that can make that agreement that would create a viable, sustainable end to the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Precisely, and I feel like that nuance is always missing when we're talking Middle East politics, especially in the news. But, Ambassador, there was another component to the Abraham Accords, and that was on security cooperation, and um, the specifically on the enhancement of security cooperation with Israel's integration with, I believe it's called CENTCOM,
Central Command, yes.
Central
Central.
Command.
Mhm.
How has that shifted the politics in the region as a result of the Abraham Accords? Because now that's very much front and center as well as part of the Accords.
Yeah, and again, that's absolutely correct. One of the major decisions that the Trump administration made was that the U.S. military is built around regional command. So there's a European command, there's a Indo-Pacific command, there's an Africa command,
Mm.
and there's also a Central Command, which is the regional security and military structure that oversees U.S. military deployments, cooperation, all of the aspects for the entire swath of territory that goes from Morocco all the way across to Pakistan.
Hmm.
And for most of the early years of these regional commands, Israel, because of the opposition of the Arab states, Israel was part of the European Command,
Hmm.
and did not directly engage with the other states in the region. That's changed. And again, in the Trump administration, they made the decision that they were going to move Israel from the European Command to the Central Command,
Hmm.
which means that Israeli military officers are sitting in the same room with counterparts from all of the Arab states, and working with them on planning and strategy
Wow.
for regional security initiatives.
Wow.
That is a huge change, built primarily again around this shared perspective that the major threat to regional security and stability comes from Iran,
Hmm.
and that's really what brought Israel into closer proximity with the Arab states. Again, primarily with the states of the Arabian Peninsula, and that's what's allowed them to really become much more closely integrated with all of these security initiatives.
Ambassador, you read my mind. Iran is later in my outline with you, but I wanted to ask you first about the. Oh, I want to ask you first about the economic collaboration with Israel. And so some say that the collaborations that are embedded in the Abraham Accords may actually exacerbate existing inequalities within the region when it comes to the haves versus the have-nots. We mentioned Morocco, we mentioned the Israeli tourists there. What are your thoughts about that? How do you respond to folks who criticize the Abraham Accords for kind of playing up the whole economic disparity piece, because there are countries in the Middle East that are very much developing in every sense of the word?
Well, there's no doubt that one of the big attractions for the UAE, for the United Arab Emirates, in signing the Abraham Accords was again their ability to establish closer links to Israeli high tech industries,
Mm.
to other kinds of economic opportunities, investment back and forth. And among all of the states of the Abraham Accords, the UAE was best positioned to take advantage of these economic opportunities, and they've done that. And you're quite right in saying that in some ways, because they can work with Israeli business, the private sector, on an almost equal footing. I mean, certainly the Israelis are more sophisticated. They have more leading cutting edge kind of industries, and they're certainly have greater access to some of the advantages of being a Western oriented society.
Mhm.
But the Emirates is of all of those states the most co-equal with Israel, and has therefore been able to take the greatest advantage of these economic opportunities.
Mhm.
And so we've seen that. The Bahrainis, to a somewhat lesser extent, but they've worked very hard. They've signed a number of agreements with Israel.
Mhm.
Morocco, again, as we've discussed, sees some opportunities really to formalize and normalize the relationship, and to get access to Israel and Israelis more than they did in the past.
Ambassador, you mentioned earlier the political winds in Israel being more far right than ever before. And in many ways, that aligns well with, not to say that Trump administration is far right, but right of center. And, understanding that Netanyahu did not have the best relationship with Obama, particularly in the second term of Obama's presidency. I wanted to know from you, as Israel moves further to the right, do you think that is what's emboldening Hamas, movements like Hamas and other countries to say, and other political factions to say, they're moving way too far right? There's no moderate leadership in Israel. And as a result, we need to be more emboldened in our, not acknowledging Israel as a state, denouncing Israel completely and then working against them every chance we get.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily see that that was the calculus. Of course, what was the objective of the Hamas leadership? When they decided to launch the attack on October 7th.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, one can speculate
Yeah.
that the objective was really to demonstrate the centrality of the Israel-Palestine conflict in the broader region. And if that were the case, then they've been pretty successful at that.
Yes.
I think that what we're seeing, and that has long-term implications for Israel's standing in the world, is that the aftermath of October 7th, the Israeli military operations in Gaza that have been going on now for 10 months, have really changed the international perception of Israel as a democracy, of Israel as a country that was committed to peaceful resolution of conflicts, and that that has changed the perception. So it's not so much what Hamas was thinking on October 7th or before October 7th, is what has happened since then, and what we're seeing certainly here in the U.S., but I think also in the West, probably also in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
is that people are much less sympathetic to the Israeli position than they used to be.
Right.
They are more willing to look at the situation and to recognize that there are no innocent victims here.
Mm-hmm.
That nobody has been doing what they could to avoid conflict. That in fact, on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side, what you've seen are that there are people who are interested in pursuing these cycles of violence that have occurred over the years, and that what we really needed to do is to see a change. And I think that hopefully, what we're going to see is that after we get a ceasefire in Gaza, when we get into a post-conflict situation, there will be more pressure again in the international community to press for a final resolution of this conflict,
Mm-hmm.
to get to a situation that is sustainable and that recognizes the rights of both Israelis and Palestinians to live in peace and security.
Ambassador, I hope you are 100% right on that, and I hope that you lend your expertise and over 4 decades of experience to that, because you are in one of the best positions, I think, to really spearhead that. Ambassador, on that piece, so here in Toronto, there have been a lot of pro-Palestinian rallies. I'm wondering, and this is not on my notes, but I'm wondering from your perspective, do you think October 7th has shifted fundamentally our domestic politics in the West, where before more conservative politicians would come forward, almost, I hate to characterize this as such, but blind support for Israel under all circumstances? Do you think that even conservative thinkers now are saying, even that is a bit of an extreme policy? We need to really rethink this in terms of our effect and our impact in the region.
Well, I think that what you've certainly seen is that divisions have come up within domestic politics here in the United States for sure. Certainly in Western Europe, in the UK, probably in Canada as well. And that what used to be accepted across the board, that there were no differences between here in the United States, between Republicans and Democrats on this. Everybody was completely supportive of Israel, of the special relationship between Israel and the United States. I think that that's more open for debate now,
Mm-hmm.
particularly among more progressive elements in the Democratic Party and in the U.S. And at large, and that people are now more willing again to challenge what has been an accepted policy for many years, and that is again that we that we will support Israel regardless of anything else. That we will never differentiate between our interests and Israeli interests. I think people are now willing to say, well, maybe that's not exactly correct, and maybe we should
Hmm.
look more carefully at the situation and understand the history and the nature of this conflict.
Ambassador, I wanted to almost end our conversation, not fully end our conversation, with the non signatory states to the Abraham Accords. There's 22 countries in the Middle East. I believe 18 did not sign on to the Abraham Accords. Sudan signed on to the Abraham Accords. I did not know that. Um, but I wanted to ask specifically about Iran. Ambassador, when Iran found out the news about the Abraham Accords, I'm imagining they automatically denounced this. They said probably that this is further Western imperialism in the region. But what has been Iran's influence post Abraham Accords signing within the region, and particularly with the signatories that have signed on to the Abraham Accords?
Well, again, I mean, I'm looking at it primarily from the perspective of the Arabian Peninsula,
Hmm.
because Morocco, of course, is a long way away from Iran, and
Yeah.
the relationship between Iran and Morocco is not really of that much significance.
Hmm.
But for the six states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, this is extremely important, and for the two Gulf signatories, UAE and Bahrain. But you know, it, but the dynamic is very interesting, and I think that if you look at the Abraham Accords in the larger context, I mean, we talked a little bit about the security interests that the parties have in signing the agreements. We look also at the economic interests; those are all very much there. But at the same time that the Emiratis were pursuing the Abraham Accords, the Bahraini signed on. They were also engaged in dialogue with Tehran. And they were also looking at ways to reduce tension. If you go back and you look at the early days of the Trump administration, at the same time that they were pursuing these very strong pro-Israel positions, they were taking steps to promote integration of Israel into the broader region, but they were also pursuing a very hard line, aggressive stance towards Iran.
Hmm.
And at times it looked as though there was the possibility of open conflict between the United States and Iran. At a certain point, towards the latter part of the Trump administration, this made the Gulf states uncomfortable for a couple of reasons. One is that they recognized, and in fact, the Iranians were absolutely open in declaring that if there was a conflict between the United States and Iran, that their target would be the UAE, their target would be Saudi Arabia, and that they would have the capacity to really inflict a great deal of damage on the Gulf states. And that made the Gulf states very nervous because they didn't want they didn't want to be the ground zero for a conflict, and they weren't absolutely convinced that the Trump administration was going to come to their rescue. So they opened a channel of dialogue with Iran at the same time that they began talking to the Israelis. And fundamentally, I think what needs to be understood is that the Gulf states that have been living under this threat of regional instability, insecurity, the possibility of conflict for many, many years, really since the Iranian Revolution and the first Gulf War, really don't want to continue focusing so heavily on security issues. They have growing populations.
Right.
They have needs to recalibrate their economies, move away from dependency on fossil fuels,
Hmm.
and develop alternative economic issues, interests, and also energy interests. Move away from their own dependence on fossil fuels to renewables, to more resilience in their energy, and that costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of time. And so if you look at the Abraham Accords as part of a larger movement in the Gulf region to try to resolve outstanding conflicts, to improve the stability and security of the region in order to allow them to focus on their domestic political and economic interests, then you recognize that they have taken steps that address both the conflict with Israel but also the conflict with Iran, and that's going on.
Hmm.
To this day, we saw the role that Beijing played in trying to broker an agreement between the Saudis and the Iranians, reopening embassies, taking other steps. The Emiratis reopened their embassies. The Bahrainis, who had a somewhat more negative view of Iran based on the conflict between Bahrain and Iran in the late 1970s, early 1980s, were a little bit slower, but they did come around, and they have also opened a channel of dialogue with Iran. So,
Hmm.
so while the Iranians clearly saw that the Abraham Accords could be a threat to their security interests, it could be a security cooperation agreement that's aimed at at their role in the region. Nevertheless, also understand that they have a much more uh, uh, balanced relationship with the Gulf states today than they did 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, and they've been okay with that.
Ambassador, in many ways, and I'm certain you're a student of history as well, but it just reminds me so much of when, Cortez lands in Mexico and he sees this fragmented population of indigenous communities who really despised the center, the Aztec Tenochtitlan, and the leader because he was charging so much taxes to the regions. And Cortez smartly started making those alliances around the city center to help his ultimate invasion a few years later. And I just wonder, thinking everything you've said, it boggles my mind. Iran must have known and have seen what had been building in the shadows all this time, that the Gulf states felt very alienated from the security threat and wanted to build up their domestic their domestic policy, but also their domestic economies. Why didn't Iran, in some ways, and maybe they did, extend some level of olive branch to allow the Gulf states to develop their domestic economies to avoid a potential Abraham Accord and further, U.S.ification, if you'd like to say it, call it that, when it comes to Middle Eastern politics?
Well, it's a good question. You should have an Iranian guest on and ask that question. But
Yes.
because I think that to a certain extent the Iranians, I mean, look, the Iran is an old country. It's a country, of 80 million people. It's much bigger than the Gulf states. They tend to look a little skeptically
Hmm.
at the Gulf states. I think that the Iranians primarily see that their security threat in the region comes from the United States,
Hmm.
not from the Gulf states. So I think that over time they haven't really taken that issue very seriously.
Hmm.
They do, and they would like to see greater economic relationships between the Gulf and Iran. They recognize that the Gulf states can be a great source of investment, a great source of economic support. So they're not against that, but I don't think that they see the Gulf states as really being their primary source of concern.
Ambassador, we've only scratched the surface on the Abraham Accords. There's a lot more to uncover. I have this deep appreciation for people such as yourself who spend their career, their life, understanding the nuance, the complexity, and the risk involved in the policies that are being put forward. So, as a Canadian, thank you for your service. But Ambassador, I wanted to end our conversation on a much more lighter note because I didn't spend this hour talking about you and your career, although I really did want to, trust me. Um, I want to ask you, what's one thing that you assumed going into understanding the Middle East region and politics, and one thing you came out saying, "Wow, that really shifted my worldview on Middle Eastern politics." I know there's multiple, perhaps in a day, but if there's one you could probably impart specifically to young people who are, studying Middle Eastern politics, want to get involved in international development, what would you say is one of those really good stories you have?
Well, an interesting question, not an easy question to answer. Um, one thing that I would say is there's a tendency in the West, I think, to look at the Arab world as being, monolithic.
Hmm.
That everybody is more or less the same, that everybody has the same history, culture, social perspectives. It's not correct. I think that if you're interested in the Gulf region, or you're interested even in the broader Middle East, it's important to understand that all of these societies are distinctive, that they all have their own histories, they have their own way of looking at the roles. And if you're going to really participate, then you need to understand. You need to understand these distinctions, and you need to look at each of these societies as really being unique and individual. So
Hmm.
that's that.
Hmm.
But you're right. There's so many things. I think one of the things that anybody who's involved with foreign affairs needs to understand is that no matter how much time you spend, and no matter how deeply you delve into these individual cultures, you never really understand. You never really
Hmm.
can have the perspective that people who are in those societies have, and therefore you should always be a little humble about expressing views about other societies and cultures.
Ambassador, it's that age old, be the sponge in the room, learn, listen, ask
Yeah,
questions at a later time, just
yeah.
absorb and understand the tonalities and all that. Um, this has been a true honor, Ambassador. Again, we barely scratched the surface. I hope you come back on. I have so many more questions on the Abraham Accords and the region. We didn't even chat about what's happening right now in the region, and how much of a tinderbox it is. But thank you so much for spending just about an hour with me. This has been the highlight of my entire podcast journey. So thank you again.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Christopher, and certainly happy to talk to you again.